Shabbat Shalom. My name is Mike Klopfenstein. I'm an elder here at MNLT, and it's March 28th, and we're blessed to be able to bring our Bible study series entitled Original Intent, By Grace Are You Saved, Not of Works, Part 2. This will be posted online for our viewers that are at home honoring the quarantine. And the PDF of this series will also be published online at mnlt.org. So, Original Intent, By Grace Are You Saved, Not of Works, Part 2. I mentioned in Part 1 that within the last century there's been a theological shift in terms of the importance of keeping commandments to the point where it is now a person is working for one's salvation if he tends to put importance on the Ten Commandments of the Torah. So when did this shift occur? And I would propose that it has occurred in the last century. The theme verse of this series is from Ephesians 2, verses 8 through 9. For by grace are you saved through faith, and not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. And the purpose of this study is to determine the original intent that prompted this statement by Paul to the church of Ephesus. Was it because the followers of Messiah in that day believed that keeping the Torah, the law of Moses, in its entirety is what saved a person? Or was it something very specific contained in the law of Moses that Paul was addressing that crept into the church as Gentile believers were beginning to swell their ranks? And I would propose to you that it was something very specific that Paul was addressing. In fact, I will propose a specific issue that he was addressing was a major theme of many of his writings. And that specific issue was the law of circumcision of the flesh, and that can be referenced in Acts 15:1, which we covered last week. And so I have, for the sake of the listeners here, a timetable of the events of Paul's life. And this is critically important to begin to put together this scenario, this picture of what was the original intent of this term, by grace are you saved, not of works. Now, I will say from the very start that from the very beginning of time, since man sinned, that man has always had to rely on grace through faith to be saved. It's not a new concept. It didn't begin 2,000 years ago. It's always been. And we're going to see that. So what specific issue was Paul needing to address in his letters? And I will say that often many of the defenses that people might make against the Torah or against the importance of keeping the commandments come from Paul's letters. And so we're going to cover that. So the pattern of the issue of circumcision mentioned in many of Paul's letters leads us to the question, what was the underlying original intent of the reason for Paul focusing on the concept of saved by grace and not of works? But before we get to the book of Galatians, which is what this study is going to end up covering, we need to set a premise with the main verses concerning grace and works. So the terms saved by grace and not of works, it's interesting, it was never mentioned by Yeshua himself. Why? If he was trying to do away with the law, the Torah, or the importance of it, and teach people to rely on grace only, then why did he never mention it if it was a problem with his audience? In fact, Yeshua was asked multiple times, what must I do to be saved? And how did Yeshua answer the question? He did not use the term that Paul used, by grace are you saved, not of works. Instead, he referenced the law, the Torah. And one example is in Luke chapter 10, verses 25 and 28. He says, and behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tempted him, saying, Master, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And he said unto him, what is written in the law or the Torah? How do you read it? And he answered and said, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy strength, and with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. And he said unto him, Thou hast answered right, this do, and thou shalt live. But if, when Yeshua came, if what he was teaching, that many of the Christian theologians have teach today that the law was done away with, why did Yeshua, why wouldn't have this been a good time for him to set the record straight? See, the term saved by grace and not of works was never mentioned by Yeshua himself. Again, why? So we have to answer that question. The original intent and context of this phrase centered around the core issue of circumcision of the flesh made with hands. That a certain sect of the Pharisees had taught, except you be circumcised after the manner of Moses, you cannot be saved. And this can be referenced in Acts chapter 15. And so the reason it only shows up in Paul's writings is because the reason it only shows up in Paul's writings and not during Yeshua's ministry is because Yeshua's mission field was to who? It was to the house of Israel, also called the circumcision. And he commanded his disciples to only go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. The issue centered around a very unique audience, the Gentiles. So when did the gospel mission change to include the Gentiles? After the end of the 70 weeks prophesied in the book of Daniel. So it's kind of important that we go back in history and we understand, Yeshua's purpose and his mission here. Because, he did mention to the disciples, he says, I have only come but to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And he told them to take the gospel to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Why was that? Why did he just send them to a specific group of people? Well, it was in order to answer the prophecy of Daniel in response to that. So let's take a look at that. So again, this helps explain the timeline of when this issue came up and why Paul had to deal with it and why Yeshua never had to deal with it. So if we go to the book of Daniel, chapter 9, verses 24 through 26, and it says 70 weeks. Now, the term 70 weeks is interpreted as 77s, because a week has 7 days. Or 490 years is the interpretation. So 70 weeks or 490 years are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, and to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and the prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. So know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks, or 7 times 7, 49 years, which is what it took to build the temple, and 62 weeks, or 434 years after that. It says, the street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublesome times. And then after 62 weeks shall the Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. So who is this person that will confirm the covenant with many for 1 week? It's the Messiah. And that 1 week is 7 years. So he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, 3.5 years, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and then that determinant shall be poured upon the desolate. So, in summary, what does it say here? The Messiah. So the prophecy in Daniel was from the time that Cyrus gave the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem unto the Messiah was going to be a certain amount of years. It took him 49 years to build the temple, and then about 434 years after that, the Messiah came on the scene, just as Daniel had prophesied. So in summary, the Messiah was crucified in the middle of the last week before the 70 weeks was up. He ministered for 3.5 years, cut off in the middle of the 69th week, just short of the 70 weeks of prophecy, or 490 years. Yeshua sent his disciples out only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel to finish his work. Why? Because that was the prophecy that Daniel had mentioned. The end of the 70 weeks of prophecy upon Israel was fulfilled 3.5 years after Yeshua was resurrected. So it's interesting. So, shortly after the 3.5 years ended of the apostles ministering to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, Paul, formerly Saul, was converted on the way to Damascus around 37 AD. So his mission, as stated in Acts 9:15, says, "For he is a chosen vessel unto me, to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel." So, shortly after the 70 weeks was up, just within a few years, Paul was converted, and his mission was to go to the Gentiles. Why? Again, Messiah came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. The disciples were sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel because they had to fulfill the 70 weeks that Daniel had prophesied of dealing with Israel. And then after that, they were to take that gospel, continue to take it to the Israel, lost sheep of the house of Israel, but also take that gospel to the Gentiles. So, again, around 37 AD, just a few years after Yeshua was crucified, after the 70 weeks of prophecy was fulfilled, Paul was chosen to bear his name before the Gentiles. So Paul returned to Jerusalem about 40 AD to meet with the other apostles. This is going to be found in Acts chapter 9, verse 26. And then shortly after, approximately 41 AD, Peter was given a vision to go to the house of Cornelius, a Gentile. So the call to take the gospel to the Gentiles could not begin until after Yahweh dealt with Israel, according to Daniel's prophecy for 70 weeks or 77s. And it was after that point that the gospel began to be preached to the Gentiles, which created a new issue or dilemma. And that issue was the uncircumcised in the flesh coming to the Messiah. And I hope this explains or gives some explanation to why the term circumcision of the flesh, or this term that they could only go to the lost sheep of house of Israel, was because of this timetable here. So, last week in part 1, we discussed the context of Ephesians chapter 2, in which this phrase, for by grace you're saved, not of works, lest any man should boast, occurs. So, in this chapter, Paul was explaining how the law of commandments contained in ordinances of man, we can see this in Acts chapter 10:35, an ordinance of man, how those ordinances had built walls of separation between Israel and the other nations, and it created an enmity between the two, and between the Gentiles, who were called uncircumcision, by them that were called circumcision in the flesh, made with hands, i.e. the Jews or Israel. So the term, by grace are you saved, not of works, lest any man should boast, is connected to this concept of circumcision that a certain sect of the Pharisees had taught that one must accomplish in order to be saved. So to verify this, let's look at and see how this term, not of works, lest any man should boast, is used in Romans 3:27. So before we go there, I want to just reread the verses in Ephesians 2:8 and 9. For it says, "For by grace are you saved through faith." And I believe that's always been the case from the Garden of Eden after man sinned. "And that not of yourselves, it is a gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast." So now we're going to take this phrase, "not of works, lest any man should boast," and we're going to connect it to the context that it is used in Romans chapter 2 and 3. So I pick up in Romans chapter 2 and verse 10. and we need to read all these verses just to give the context of what Paul is dealing with. So in Romans 2, chapter 2, verse 10, but glory, honor, and peace to every man that worketh good, to the Jew first, and also to the Gentile. For there is no respect of persons with God. For as many as have sinned without the law shall perish without the law. So this phrase, I just want to mention, what does it mean, for as many as have sinned without the law shall also perish without the law? I believe this is connected to, if you remember, who was the law, who was the Torah given to, entrusted to take to the nations? It was Israel. Okay, so this term that for many as have sinned without the law, I believe is referring to the Gentiles who were not entrusted with the law. It says that they shall also perish without the law. And as many as have sinned in the law, so the Israel who was entrusted with the law, they had the guidance, and they sinned. It says, they shall be judged by the law. And he goes on to say in verse 13, for not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. For when the Gentiles which have not the law, so this gives us a definition of what it meant by as many have sinned without the law, and I believe it's referring to the Gentiles. For when the Gentiles which have not the law, they were not entrusted with it, do by nature the things contained in the law or the Torah, these having not the law are not entrusted with the law, are a law unto themselves, which show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts the more, while accusing or else excusing one another. In the day when God judges the secrets of men by Yeshua the Messiah, according to my gospel, behold, thou art called a Jew, and restest in the law, and makest thy boast of God, and knowest his will, and approvest the things that are more excellent, being instructed out of the law, and art confident that thou thyself art a guide of the blind, a light of them which are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, which hast the form of knowledge and of the truth in the law. Thou therefore which teachest another, do you teach yourself? Thou that preachest a man should not steal, do you steal? Thou that sayest a man should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? Thou that abhorrest idols, dost thou commit sacrilege? Thou that makest thy boast of the law, through breaking the law, you dishonor God. In other words, you brag about the importance of the law, which it is important, okay, because you were entrusted with it, but when you break those things, you dishonor God. For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you, as it is written, for circumcision verily profiteth. So now it brings in this issue of circumcision. Why? Because that's the core of the issue. For circumcision verily profits if you keep the Torah. But if you be a breaker of the Torah, your circumcision is made uncircumcision. Therefore, if the uncircumcision keep the righteousness of the Torah, shall not his uncircumcision be counted for circumcision? So Paul's making a case here that if the uncircumcision, he's making reference to the Gentiles because they by nature were not circumcised according to Torah as the Israelites were. So he said, if therefore the uncircumcision, the Gentiles, keep the righteousness of the Torah, shall not his uncircumcision, physical uncircumcision of the flesh, be counted for circumcision, circumcision of the heart? And shall not the uncircumcision which is by nature, if it fulfill the law, judge you, who by the letter and circumcision do transgress the law? For he is not a Jew which is one outwardly, neither is circumcision which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew which is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, and not in the letter, whose praise is not of men, but of God. So we see the context here. Now we're going to get to that verse that talks about works and boasting here in the latter part of Romans 3, but I want to set the context here of what Paul's dealing with. He's dealing with this issue of circumcision, physical circumcision, and why the Gentiles, he's making a case here, if they keep the righteousness of the Torah, it says that their circumcision, which you see, the physical circumcision, it becomes circumcision of the heart. So let's go on, Romans chapter 3, verse 1. So what advantage then hath the Jew, or what profit is there of circumcision? Much in every way, chiefly because unto them were committed the oracles of God. For what if some did not believe? Shall their unbelief make the faith of God without effect? God forbid, let God be true, but every man a liar, as it is written, that thou mightest be justified in thy sayings, and mightest overcome when thou art judged. But if our unrighteousness commend the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Is God unrighteous who takes vengeance? I speak as a man. God forbid. For then how shall God judge the world? For if the truth of God hath more abounded through my lie unto his glory, why yet am I also judged as a sinner? And not rather as we be slanderously reported, and as some affirm that we say, let us do evil that good may come, whose damnation is just. So what then? Are we better than they or the Gentiles? No, in no wise, for we have before proved, both Jews and Gentiles, that they are all under sin. As it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one. Verse 11, there is none that understandeth, there is none that seeketh after God. So Paul's making a comparison here that, although the Jews were entrusted with the Torah, and they were circumcised according to Torah, but yet if they didn't keep the Torah, that circumcision meant nothing. It only meant something if they kept the Torah. And so likewise with the Gentiles, if they keep the Torah, then their uncircumcision becomes circumcision. And we're going to understand why this seemingly conflict with Exodus chapter 12 is coming up in this time and this age. There's an answer to that. Okay, so in verse 12 it says, for they are all gone out of the way, they are together become unprofitable. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. So Paul's making a point here. Gentiles, they've messed up. The Jews, they've messed up. So in context, both Jew and Gentile, they've all messed up. So it says, their throat is an open sepulchre, their tongues they have used deceit, the poison of asps is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood, destruction and misery are in their ways, and the way of peace have they not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. But now we know that what things soever the law saith, it says to them who are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped, and all the world may become guilty before God. So we see here, the term law is, we have to understand the context of what law it's talking about in the context. So here we're talking about the law of circumcision contained in the law of Moses, and we're also talking about the law of sin, the law that identifies what sin is. So it's mixing both up, so we have to use the context to know which law we're talking about. So it's talking about both here. The thing we can't do is lump all the law into any discussion that talks about a particular part of the law. We have to be able to decide when it's talking about a specific law in the Torah or it's talking about the law in general as a whole. Therefore, by the deeds of the law, I'm in verse 20, there shall no flesh be justified in his sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin. So here it's talking about all the law. But now the righteousness of God without the law is manifest, being witnessed by the law and the prophets. So here we have this concept. How can the righteousness of God be accomplished without the law? being witnessed by the law and the prophets. Even the righteousness of God, which is by faith of Yeshua the Messiah, unto all and upon all them that believe, for there is no difference. So we see this concept of righteousness without the law or without the deeds of the law. It's been manifested all through the Torah and the prophets. It's there, okay? And it was through this promised Messiah. For all have sinned and come short of the glory, verse 23. Being justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in the Messiah Yeshua, whom God had sent forth to be a propitiation through faith in his blood, to declare his righteousness for the remission of sins that are past, through the forbearance of God. To declare, I say, at this time his righteousness, that he might be just and the justifier of him which believeth in Yeshua. So verse 27. Now here comes that phrase that deals with boasting of works. The phrase that we referenced in Ephesians 2:8 and 9, for by grace are ye saved through faith, not of works, lest any man should boast. Okay, so this term, not of works, lest any man should boast, we read it here in Romans 3:27. So where is boasting then? It's excluded. By what law? Of works? Nay, but by the law of faith. Therefore we conclude that a man is justified by faith without the deeds of the law. It's a Torah principle that the just shall live by faith. It's always been a principle that the just shall live by faith, that we're saved by grace through faith. It's always been a principle in the Torah. So let's discuss the concept, or let me finish reading here. Seeing it is one God, no, verse 29, is he the God of the Jews only, of the circumcision? No. Is he not also of the Gentiles, which are called uncircumcision? Now I'm adding those terms in there to give some context here. Yes, of the Gentiles also. Seeing it is one God, which shall justify the circumcision by faith and the uncircumcision through faith. Then in verse 31, do we then make void the law through faith? God forbid we establish the law. So we see here that this concept of boasting, of works, it's connected to this idea, is there something, that I can boast of that makes me a better person than somebody else, or that guarantees me, that right to eternal life? There were many Pharisees and scribes and believers, in Yeshua's day, that believed that because they were the children of Abraham, they were physical sons of Abraham, they were circumcised, they understood the Torah, and they were following the Torah is how they understood it. They believed just because they were physical sons that they were guaranteed, inheritance in the kingdom. And remember what Yeshua said, I could raise up children of Abraham from these stones. So that was no guarantee. So boasting, where is it? It isn't in your circumcision. It isn't in the fact that you're a physical seed of Abraham. It's through faith. It's always been through faith. But this issue is coming up because of the issue of Acts 15. Many, or some in a certain sect of the Pharisees, were requiring the Gentiles, in order to be saved, they had to be physically circumcised. That's why Paul's bringing this issue up. It wasn't because the people had this idea that keeping the commandments, if by doing that somehow they're trying to work for their salvation. That wasn't their mindset then. That mindset, as I mentioned earlier, I believe has just come around in the last century. And I say that because 100 years ago, and many people older people can relate to this, there are what we call blue laws on the books. And the blue laws were Sabbath laws. But at that time, the Sunday was a Sabbath. And people that honored that, they did not work on Sunday. They did not buy or sell on Sunday. And so many, a century ago, would honor the commandments as very important, okay, not for works' sake, but as by believing by faith and saved by grace, that the outcome of that was that we want to please our Heavenly Father. So they obeyed the commandments, not for work's sake, but because out of love. But that mindset, that theology has shifted away just in the last century to now if you try to honor or keep anything in the commandments, that you're trying to work for your salvation. It's a new concept. Now, go back 2,000 years ago. There was something that came up with a certain sect that they believed that you had to do this in order to be saved. So it's kind of a similar idea, but it was only in one respect to the Torah, not the whole Torah. So let's discuss the concept of grace in order to be saved. How long has this concept been around? In Romans chapter 5, verses 20 and 21, it says, "Moreover, the law entered that the offense might abound. But where sin abounded, grace did much more. That as sin hath reigned unto death, even so might grace reign through righteousness unto eternal life by Yeshua the Messiah our Lord." So we see that where sin abounded, grace did much more. So sin abounded in the garden. So grace was from the garden. And then we go to Ephesians chapter 2. At the beginning of that chapter, before Paul brings in, this concept of you're saved by grace through faith, not of works, it's talking about here, Paul's main audience is Gentiles. And so he begins in verse 1 of chapter 2, and he says, "And you hath he quickened who were dead in trespasses and sins, where in times past you walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now worketh in the children of disobedience, among whom also we all had our conversation in times past in the lust of our flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh as of the mind, and were by nature the children of wrath, even as others. But God, who is rich in mercy, for his great love wherewith he loved us, even when we were dead in sins, he hath quickened us together with the Messiah. By grace are you saved, and hath raised us up together and made us to sit together in heavenly places in the Messiah Yeshua, that in the ages to come he might show the exceeding riches of his grace and his kindness toward us through Messiah the Yeshua." Now, here's a question, the concept. By grace are you saved? In verse 5, it's recorded in the event on Mount Sinai, when Moses received the second set of the Ten Commandments at the hand of Yahweh. Saved by grace is part of the Torah. It's embedded in the Torah, all throughout the Torah. So let's go to that event on Mount Sinai to look at this concept, by grace are you saved. In Exodus 34, we read in verse 4, "And he hewed 2 tables of stone like unto the first. And Moses rose up early in the morning and went up to the Mount Sinai. And as Yahweh had commanded him, and took in his hand the 2 tables of stone. And Yahweh descended in a cloud and stood with him there, and proclaimed the name of Yahweh. And Yahweh passed by before him." I'm in verse 6 of Exodus 34. "And Yahweh passed by before him and proclaimed, Yahweh, Yahweh God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering, and abundant in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, and that will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children and upon the children's children unto the 3rd and 4th generation. And Moses made haste and bowed his head toward the earth and worshipped." And verse 9, this is key. "And he said, If now I have found grace in thy sight, O Lord, let my Lord, I pray thee, go among us. For it is a stiff-necked people, pardon our iniquity and our sin, and take us for thine inheritance. So we see on the mount as Yahweh handed Moses the 10 commandments, he goes on to say, Moses pleads with him and says, if we have found grace in your sight, pardon our iniquity, our sin, and take us for thine inheritance. This narrative here is what we just read in Ephesians chapter 2. The same narrative. For by grace are you saved. And it's important to identify the one who Moses received these living oracles from, so we can make a connection with the source of grace and truth as explained in John 1:17. So this may seem like a little bit of a shift, but I think it's important because there's this concept or this idea that grace and truth is something separate from the law that Moses delivered to the people. And that grace and truth came 2,000 years ago, and it wasn't before then that it existed. And I'm here to say that the Torah teaches that grace and truth was from the beginning. And this grace and truth that came by Yeshua, this one that handed Moses the 10 commandments, the evidence supports that this was Yeshua himself handing those commandments, the oracles, to Moses. And then it was Moses that delivered them to the people. So I think it's important that we identify who the one was that Moses received the oracles from, so we can make this connection with this source of grace and truth, as explained in John 1:17. So quickly, in Acts chapter 7, verses 35 through 38, it says, this Moses, whom they refused, saying, who made you a ruler and a judge? The same did God send to be a ruler, and he delivered by the hand of the angel which appeared to him in the bush. He brought them out after that he had showed wonders and signs in the land of Egypt, and in the Red Sea, and in the wilderness 40 years. This is that Moses which said to the children of Israel, a prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren, like unto me. Him shall ye hear. Now I put references in the handout, or that I'll be posting online in the PDF, of connections. When Moses had, or in Acts here where it says that God shall raise unto you of your brethren like unto me, him shall ye hear, that phrase, ye shall hear, there's a connection to the one that was with Moses, that spoke to Moses in the wilderness and in the mount. Exodus 23:20-23. Acts 7:38. For this is he, that's referring to Moses, that was in the church in the wilderness with the angel. Now who's the angel that was with him, which spoke to him in Mount Sinai? So this angel spoke to him in Mount Sinai. So we want to identify who this angel, who this messenger was, and was with our fathers, who Moses received the living oracles to give unto us. So now I want to make this connection, this picture. So we have Moses on Mount Sinai, right? And he's with the assembly in the wilderness with this angel which spoke to him in Mount Sinai. So he's up on this mountain. He's talking to this angel. He receives from this angel living oracles to give unto us. Now let's go to Exodus 23, verses 20-23. Behold, I send an angel before you to keep you in the way, to bring you into the place that I have prepared. Does this sound familiar of somebody that's leading us into the land? Beware of him and obey his voice. Provoke him not, for he will not pardon your transgressions, for my name is in him. So we just read in Acts 37, it talked about this person that, or this person that God's going to raise up unto you of your brethren, like unto me. Him you shall hear. This person that he's talking about that you will hear, he's referencing here in Exodus 23:21. Beware of him, obey his voice, provoke him not, for he will not pardon your transgressions, for my name is in him. Verse 22, but if thou shalt indeed obey his voice, and do all that I speak, then I will be an enemy unto thine enemies, and an adversary unto thine adversaries. For mine angel shall go before you, to bring you into the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, and I will cut them off. Now, who was this angel that spoke to Moses in the bush? Who was this angel that was on the mount that spoke to Moses? Who was this angel that handed the living oracles to Moses? Let's go to 1 Corinthians 10, verse 4. And so this is the story of Israel coming out of Egypt and their journey. And it says, and did all drink that same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them. And that rock was the Messiah. The Messiah was this angel, this messenger of Yahweh. 1 Corinthians 10, 9 and 10. And this is something I didn't see till today as I was putting this together. It says, neither let us tempt the Messiah, present tense, as Paul's writing this, neither let us tempt the Messiah, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed of serpents. So we see Paul saying, let us not tempt the Messiah, as some of them who also tempted the Messiah. So who was with them in the wilderness? Who was the one that they were tempting? It says here they tempted the Messiah. Neither murmur ye, as some of them murmured and were destroyed of the destroyer. So we go to John chapter 1, the Gospel of John. Again, making this connection of identifying the one who was with Moses, the one who talked to Moses, the one who gave the living oracles unto Moses, the one who is the author of grace and truth. So in John 1, verse 1 and 2, in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. Jumping down to verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So now we have this connection. The Messiah is connected to one who is full of grace and truth. But this grace and truth, when did he begin? It says that he was in the beginning. He was the Word. And the Word was with God. And the Word was God. The same was in the beginning. So grace and truth was from the very beginning. Verse 15, and John bare witness of him, and cried, saying, this is he of whom I spake. He that cometh after me is preferred before me, for he was before me. And of his fullness have we all received grace for grace. For the law, the Torah, was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Yeshua the Messiah. Now I want to kind of put this narrative together, what we just talked about, identifying who was with Moses on the mount. Verse 17 in John 1, we just read, for the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Yeshua the Messiah. So I want to break down these terms. For the law, the Torah, was given. Who did Moses give the Torah to? It was the people. We just read earlier in Acts 7:38. It's that this is that Moses that was in the church in the wilderness with the angel, which spake to him in Mount Sinai, who received the living oracle. So he received something to give unto us, the people. So we see the same narrative happening here in John 1:17. For the law was given to the people by Moses, but the grace and truth came. That word came is gnomi. It means come into being. So the grace and the truth, the Torah, that was the living oracles that was given to Moses, came into being by Yeshua the Messiah. And then in verse 18 in John 17, this is so key to make this point that this was the Yeshua who gave the Torah, the living oracles to Moses. Verse 18 of in John 1 says, "No man has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, for he hath declared him." Now, why would John, the Apostle John, why would he interject that no man has seen God at any time except Yeshua, immediately following the statement that the Torah was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Yeshua? Why would he interject this statement that no man has seen God at any time? The narrative in the Gospel of John is identifying the source of what Moses received, the Torah, which is full of grace and truth. This grace and truth was handed to Moses by Yeshua himself. The point here is grace and truth was from the beginning, and the source of that grace and truth is Messiah Yeshua. So I just want to close with a few comments here as we go through this series to try and understand the original intent. By grace are you saved, not of works. The original, the patriarchs, and from Adam and Eve, they understood that the only way they could be saved was by grace through faith. They understood that, okay? And so what was unique in Paul's day when writing to the church of Ephesus, when writing to those in Rome, when writing to those in Colossians, in Galatians, what was unique? Because something had changed in their mindset, that there was something in the Torah they believed that they had to do physically in order to be saved. Even though you kept the Torah in loving your neighbor as yourself and loving God with all your heart, they added something that they felt the Gentiles needed to be part and partakers of the blessings of Abraham, and it was that physical circumcision. So this idea that grace and truth began 2,000 years ago, it did not begin 2,000. It began 6,000 years ago, at creation, after Adam and Eve sinned, and then it's prevalent all through the Torah. And when John said that in John 1:17, when he said that the Torah was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Yeshua, it isn't trying to separate the two in terms of it's one or the other. What he's saying there is the source of the Torah that was Moses had given to the people came from Messiah himself. Remember, Moses said that he would raise up from among his brethren, among Israel, a prophet like unto Moses. It says, him you shall hear, right? Him you shall hear. And it was the same people at Mount Sinai that the words from Yeshua that were spoken, that they did not, they heard physically, but they would not obey. And it's the same today, from 2,000 years ago to today. It's the same thing, that the words that are spoken, that he spoke on Mount Sinai, that many are not hearing. And we have to understand that this concept of grace are you saved, not of works, is not a concept of doing away with the Torah. It's a concept of a very specific issue in the Torah from Acts 15. So we're going to continue this series on the study of Galatians. We haven't got into the book yet, but we had to go through a lot of these concepts and ideas before we get to that book, so we can understand the full picture. So I hope you enjoyed this. And again, we're going to put this, the audio will be, and video will be online at mnlt.org. And I will also post the PDF of this study. And if you have any comments or questions, you can contact me, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. So again, thank you for your time, and may Yahweh bless you on this Shabbat. Amen.